Nathan Walker's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the settings on the energy capacitor he'd found in the cluttered aisles of the underground tech market. The dimly lit space hummed with an electric buzz, the air thick with the scent of ozone and desperation. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had promised himself he'd leave behind the shadows of his past, but the lure of rare parts he needed for his latest project had drawn him back into the underbelly of society. The faint echo of an auctioneer's voice caught his attention, cutting through the usual cacophony of haggling and machinery. It wasn't the usual barter of stolen goods or illegal tech. This was different. The voice carried a sinister enthusiasm that pricked Nathan's instincts like a blade. Against his better judgment, he followed the sound, slipping through a narrow archway and into a dimly lit chamber packed with an eager crowd. The air was alive with anticipation, charged with a tension that made Nathan uneasy. His gaze swept the room, landing on the stage where a figure stood shackled under harsh, flickering lights. At first glance, she appeared human, her slender frame cloaked in a thin, tattered garment that did little to shield her from the cold or the gazes of the crowd. But her eyes, they were unlike anything Nathan had seen before. They glowed faintly, a silver light that seemed to pierce the room, scanning it with a mix of terror and defiance. Lot 47, the auctioneer declared with a theatrical flourish. A rare Etherian specimen, remarkably intact, perfect for labor, entertainment, or experimentation. The crowd erupted into murmurs and whispers. Nathan's stomach churned. He had heard of Etherians, rumored beings from distant systems with abilities that made them both coveted and feared. Slavery wasn't new in the darker corners of the galaxy, but seeing it up close was a punch to the gut. He had seen enough of human greed to know how this would end for her. She wouldn't last long in the hands of anyone here. The auctioneer's hammer came down with a resounding thud, signaling the start of bidding. Nathan turned to leave, but as he did, her gaze locked onto his. Time seemed to slow. Her silver eyes widened, and though her lips didn't move, her expression screamed a silent plea. Nathan swore under his breath. He couldn't just walk away. His rational mind screamed at him to leave, to avoid the danger and complications that came with interfering, but something deep inside refused to let him ignore the look in her eyes. His fingers brushed against the small device tucked in his pocket, a makeshift imp generator he'd designed for emergency. He hadn't intended to use it tonight, but plans had a way of changing. The bidding escalated quickly. The numbers being thrown around were staggering, a testament to how valuable she was. Nathan moved closer to the stage, his heart pounding as he assessed the guards stationed around the room. Their weapons gleamed under the harsh lights, and their postures were rigid with discipline. It wouldn't be easy, but Nathan's mind was already working through the angles, calculating risks and outcomes. He slipped the MP generator from his pocket, thumbing the activation sequence as he moved closer to the edge of the crowd. The device hummed faintly, warming in his hand, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. A burst of static crackled through the air, and the lights flickered violently before plunging the room into darkness. Gasps and shouts erupted from the crowd as the MP swept through, disabling the guards' weapons and the security systems in one stroke. Nathan moved swiftly, using the chaos as cover. He vaulted onto the stage, reaching the girl in 3 quick strides. Her silver eyes glimmered in the faint emergency lighting as she stared up at him, equal parts hope and suspicion. "Come on," he muttered, his hands working quickly to disable the locks on her shackles. The metal restraints fell away with a dull clink, and she flinched as if unsure whether to believe her freedom was real. "Move," Nathan hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the edge of the stage. The crowd was in full panic now, scrambling for the exits as the guards barked orders, trying to regain control. The girl stumbled, her legs weak from confinement, but Nathan didn't slow. He led her through the chaos, weaving between overturned chairs and fleeing patrons. They reached a service door, and Nathan shoved it open, pulling her into the dimly lit maintenance corridors beyond. The cold air hit them like a slap, and the girl gasped, stumbling again. Nathan turned to steady her, his grip firm but not unkind. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. She nodded, though her steps were shaky. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't thank me yet," Nathan muttered, glancing over his shoulder as distant shouts grew louder. The guards were regrouping, and it wouldn't be long before they came after them. He led her through a labyrinth of corridors, relying on his memory of the station's layout. They emerged into a narrow alley behind the auction house where Nathan's battered old hovercar waited. He shoved the door open and helped her inside before sliding into the driver's seat and firing up the engine. As the car lifted off, Nathan glanced at her. She was huddled in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she stared out the window. The faint glow of her eyes reflected in the glass. A reminder of the danger she represented, Nathan exhaled slowly, gripping the controls tightly as he navigated the car through the crowded skylane. He didn't know what he was getting himself into, but one thing was clear: this wasn't going to end with a simple rescue. Nathan Walker sat at the small, worn-down table in his workshop, his fingers drumming in irregular rhythm on the metal surface. The girl Lyra, as she had finally whispered her name, was huddled in the corner of the room, wrapped in a blanket he had handed her after they'd made it back. She hadn't said much, barely meeting his eyes, and her silence weighed on him more than he cared to admit. He didn't know what to do with her. Rescuing her from the auction had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, driven by something he still couldn't fully explain. But now, the gravity of what he had done was settling in. Nathan was no stranger to trouble, but harboring a fugitive, especially one who wasn't human, was a level of risk he hadn't planned for. Across the room, Lyra shifted, her silver eyes flicking to him briefly before darting away. She hadn't let go of the blanket, clutching it like it was her last shield against the world. He wanted to ask her something, anything to break the tension, but he didn't know where to start. "You can't stay here," he said finally, the words coming out harsher than he intended. Her head snapped up, and for a moment, her gaze locked onto his, wide and unblinking. There was no mistaking the fear in her expression, but something else lingered there too, an almost imperceptible defiance. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said softly. Her voice barely more than a whisper. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, letting out a frustrated sigh. "I'm not exactly set up for house guests, especially ones with a target on their back." He leaned back in his chair, the metal creaking under his weight. "There's got to be someone somewhere you can go. Family? Friends?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked down, her hands tightening around the edges of the blanket. "They're gone," she said after a long pause. "All of them." Nathan felt a pang of guilt at the sadness in her voice, but he forced himself to stay pragmatic. He couldn't afford to get too involved. People who got involved ended up dead or worse. "Well, you can't just stay here," he said again, though the conviction in his voice was beginning to falter. "Why not?" Her voice was quiet, but there was a steel edge to it now. "You saved me. Isn't that what people do? Save others and then make sure they're okay?" Nathan stiffened, caught off guard by her sudden boldness. "I'm not a hero," he said flatly. "I don't have the resources or the connections to keep you safe. Hell, I don't even know what you are or why they were so desperate to sell you to the highest bidder." For the first time, her expression shifted into something like anger. "I didn't ask to be sold," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and pain. "I didn't ask for any of this." Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Lyra broke it. "They did things to me," she said, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear her. "Experiments, tests. They said I was unique, valuable, but I don't even know what they made me into." Nathan watched her carefully, his mind racing. He had suspected she was more than just an ordinary alien, but hearing her say it out loud confirmed what he had feared. If the people who had captured her were willing to go to such lengths to secure her, then she was far more dangerous than she looked. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "We need to figure out who's after you and why," he said, more to himself than to her. "And then we need to figure out how to make them stop." Lyra looked at him with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "You going to help me? I don't really have a choice, do I?" he muttered, grabbing a stack of old data pads from a nearby shelf. "If they find out you're here, I'm as good as dead. So yeah, I guess I'm helping you, but don't think this is some kind of charity operation. The sooner we figure this out, the sooner you're out of here." She didn't respond. but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Hours passed as Nathan combed through his datapads, searching for any mention of Etherians or the organization that had captured her. Lyra sat nearby, watching him with a guarded curiosity. Occasionally, she would ask a question or offer a piece of information, but for the most part, she remained quiet. As the night wore on, Nathan began to piece together a grim picture. The group that had auctioned her off was part of a larger network, one that specialized in trafficking rare and powerful beings. They didn't just sell slaves, they sold weapons, commodities, things that could tip the balance of power in the galaxy. And Lyra was one of their most prized possessions. You weren't just a prisoner, Nathan said finally, looking up from the screen. You were a project. They wanted to turn you into something, someone they could use. Lyra's expression darkened, her silver eyes flashing with a mix of anger and fear. They called me a weapon, she said softly, but I never wanted to hurt anyone. Nathan nodded slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. If they thought she was a weapon, then they would stop at nothing to get her back. And if she really was as powerful as they believed, then he was in way over his head. We need a plan, he said, closing the datapad. Something to keep them off our trail while we figure out how to stop them. Lyra looked at him, her expression unreadable. What if I don't want to leave? Nathan blinked, caught off guard by the question. Why wouldn't you? Because, she said quietly, this is the first place I've felt safe in a long time. And I don't think I can do this alone. Nathan stared at her for a long moment, her words hanging in the air between them. He had spent so long avoiding connections, pushing people away, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone rely on him. Fine, he said finally, his voice low but firm. You can stay, but only until we figure out how to deal with these people. After that, you're on your own. Lyra nodded, her silver eyes glinting with a mixture of gratitude and determination. Deal? Nathan wasn't sure if he believed her, but for now, it would have to be enough. The days turned into a blur of movement, planning, and tension as Nathan and Lyra worked to stay ahead of the people hunting her. The fragile sense of safety they'd had in the workshop was shattered less than a week after her arrival when Nathan noticed the subtle signs of surveillance and unmarked drone hovering too close, unfamiliar figures loitering near his building. It wasn't a matter of if they'd be found, but when Nathan moved quickly, gathering what he could and preparing to leave the life he'd built behind. He hadn't stayed in one place for so long in years, and tearing himself away felt like ripping open an old wound. But Lyra was his priority now, whether he liked it or not. She had started to trust him, and though she hadn't said as much, Nathan could see it in the way she followed his instructions without hesitation, her silver eyes darting to him whenever danger loomed. The first leg of their escape was chaotic. The truck Nathan had rigged for stealth and speed barely outpaced the pursuit drones that screamed after them as they tore through the industrial outskirts of the city. Lyra clung to the dashboard, her glowing eyes fixed on the road ahead. She didn't cry out when a drone's pulse shot exploded inches from the truck, narrowly missing the fuel line, nor did she falter when Nathan barked at her to help reload the MP launcher. She was calm, focused, almost unnervingly so. When the chase ended in the barren stretches of the desert, Nathan pulled over to assess the damage to the truck. His hands shook as he inspected the charred edges of the vehicle's undercarriage. Lyra watched him silently, her own calm beginning to unnerve him. You okay? He asked, his voice rough. She nodded but said nothing, her expression unreadable. Nathan almost pushed her for more but stopped himself. Whatever was going on in her head wasn't something she was ready to share, and he wasn't sure he had the energy to handle it, even if she did. As the days passed, their journey became a delicate balance of evasion and preparation. Nathan's skills as a former engineer proved invaluable as he modified stolen tech to bolster their defenses. He worked tirelessly on a cloaking device for their makeshift hideouts, using scraps of outdated military equipment and salvaged components. Lyra, for her part, began to show a surprising aptitude for understanding the systems he worked on. Though she was cautious at first, her innate curiosity soon pushed her to ask questions and experiment under Nathan's watchful eye. One night, while Nathan was tuning the cloaking system, Lyra hesitated near the edge of his workbench. He looked up to find her staring at the glowing core of the device he was holding. "Show me how it works," she said, her voice tentative. Nathan arched a brow. "You sure? It's not exactly beginner-level tech." Lyra's silver eyes met his, steady and resolute. "I want to help. If I'm going to stay, I can't just sit around and wait for you to save me." The words struck something deep within him. He handed her the tool, guiding her hands as she adjusted the device's power core. Her movements were careful but confident, and for the first time since they'd met, Nathan felt a flicker of something that wasn't dread or responsibility. It was pride. Their routine began to shift. Nathan spent hours teaching Lyra the basics of engineering, and though her knowledge of machinery was rudimentary at first, she learned quickly. Her natural aptitude for problem-solving complemented Nathan's methodical approach, and soon they were working together to improve their defenses. But it wasn't just her mind that was evolving, her powers were too. The first time Nathan saw her control the energy coursing through her body, it was an accident. They'd been holed up in an abandoned warehouse, working on a portable shield generator, when a rusted pipe collapsed near Lyra's head. She flinched, throwing up her hands instinctively, and a burst of shimmering energy erupted from her palms, disintegrating the pipe midair. Nathan stared at the spot where the pipe had been, his heart pounding. "Was that you?" Lyra looked at her hands, her expression a mix of awe and fear. "I think so." From that moment on, their focus shifted. Nathan set up crude training exercises, encouraging her to channel her energy in controlled bursts. It wasn't easy. Her power was volatile, and more than once, she accidentally destroyed the equipment they were using. But Nathan saw the determination in her eyes, the way she clenched her jaw and tried again no matter how many times she failed. Their bond deepened with each passing day. Nathan found himself relying on her as much as she relied on him, and the walls he'd built around himself began to crack. Lyra, in turn, started to open up about her past, sharing fragmented memories of her life before captivity. She spoke of a family she barely remembered, of a home that was little more than a blur in her mind. Nathan listened quietly, offering no solutions but letting her words fill the silence between them. The peace they found in each other was short-lived. One evening, as they worked side by side on a new cloaking system, Nathan's scanner began to beep furiously. His blood ran cold as he checked the screen. Multiple heat signatures were converging on their location, too many to be a coincidence. "They've found us," he said, his voice tight. Lyra froze, her hands hovering over the device they'd been working on. "What do we do?" Nathan grabbed a pack from the corner of the room, shoving their most important tools inside. "We run." But running wasn't enough this time. The organization chasing them had grown more aggressive, deploying heavily armed teams and advanced tracking systems. Every safe house Nathan had prepared was compromised within hours, leaving them with fewer and fewer places to hide. Their luck ran out when they were cornered in the ruins of an old factory. Nathan managed to disable the initial wave of attackers with a series of traps, but reinforcements arrived faster than he'd anticipated. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and Nathan knew they couldn't hold out much longer. As the enemy closed in, Lyra stepped forward, her silver eyes blazing with determination. "I can stop them." Nathan grabbed her arm, his voice sharp. "No, it's too dangerous." She pulled free, her gaze steady. "You said I wasn't a weapon, that I could choose what to be. I'm choosing to protect us." Before he could stop her, she unleashed a wave of energy that lit up the factory like a supernova. The force knocked Nathan off his feet, and when he looked up, the attackers were sprawled across the floor, unconscious but alive. Lyra stood in the center of the chaos, her chest heaving as sparks of energy crackled around her. She turned to Nathan, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "I told you I could do it," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Nathan stared at her, his mind racing. She had saved them, but the cost of using her powers was written all over her face. He didn't know what this meant for their future, but one thing was clear: they couldn't keep running. It was time to go on the offensive. The facility loomed ahead like a fortress of steel and glass, its sharp edges cutting into the skyline. Nathan crouched beside Lyra behind the cover of a rusted transport, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The air around them buzzed faintly, a testament to the energy field protecting the compound. It was exactly the kind of place he expected from an organization that dealt in the trafficking of beings like Lyra, cold, impersonal, and nearly impenetrable. "This is it," Nathan said under his breath, his fingers tightening around the device he'd rigged to disable the outer defenses. "Once we're inside, there's no turning back." Lyra didn't respond immediately. She was staring at the facility, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He had seen that look before, the quiet focus that came over her when she was trying to push past the fear. Finally, she turned to him, her voice steady. "I'm ready." Nathan nodded, more to convince himself than her. He adjusted the strap of his pack, loaded with everything they would need to infiltrate the building, and activated the device. A low hum filled the air as the energy field flickered, then dissipated. He didn't wait to see if it had worked. He darted forward, keeping low, trusting Lyra to follow. Inside, the facility was as sterile and oppressive as Nathan had imagined. The halls were eerily quiet, the faint hum of machinery the only sound. He moved quickly, relying on the layout he'd memorized from stolen blueprints. Lyra stayed close, her movements silent and precise. She was no longer the frightened girl he'd rescued weeks ago. Now she was a force of her own, her steps confident and her gaze sharp. They encountered their first resistance near the central elevator. A pair of guards, heavily armed and clad in sleek body armor, blocked their path. Nathan held up a hand, signaling Lyra to stay back. He moved swiftly, pulling out a device he'd prepared, a small improvised MP grenade. He rolled it toward the guards, and the resulting burst of energy left them stunned. Their weapons shorted out. "Move," Nathan said, motioning for Lyra to follow. She stepped past the guards without hesitation, but he caught the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched into fists. He knew what this place represented for her, and he could feel the weight of her memories pressing down on them. The elevator ride to the upper levels was tense. Nathan kept his eyes on the numbers ticking upward, while Lyra stood beside him, her expression unreadable. He wanted to say something to reassure her, but the words felt hollow in his throat. Instead, he focused on the task ahead. They were here to end this, to destroy the operation and ensure no one else would suffer as Lyra had. The doors opened to reveal a sprawling control room, bathed in cold, artificial light. At the center of the room stood a man Nathan recognized from Lyra's fragmented memories, the director of the facility. He was tall and imposing, his dark suit immaculate, his eyes cold and calculating. He turned to face them, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Well," the director said, his voice smooth and mocking, "I wasn't expecting visitors, but I suppose I should thank you for delivering my property back to me." Nathan stepped forward, his jaw tightening. "She's not your property." The director's gaze shifted to Lyra, his smile widening. "You've come a long way, haven't you? I see you've even learned to control your little tricks. Impressive, but let's not pretend this changes anything. You belong to me, and you always will." Lyra's hands began to glow, faint tendrils of energy crackling around her fingers. Nathan could feel the air around her growing charged, but he placed a hand on her arm, grounding her. "He's trying to bait you," Nathan said quietly. "Don't let him," she nodded, though her eyes never left the director. The energy around her hands subsided, but Nathan could see the fire burning just beneath the surface. The director chuckled, unperturbed. "Touching, but you're out of your depth. This facility is more secure than you can imagine, and even if you manage to destroy it, there are others. You can't stop us." Nathan didn't respond. Instead, he pulled a small device from his pack, a virus he'd spent weeks designing to infiltrate the facility's systems. He moved to the nearest terminal, his fingers flying across the keys as he initiated the upload. Alarms blared immediately, red lights flashing across the room. The director's smile faltered. "What are you doing?" "Ending this," Nathan said simply. The guards burst into the room, weapons drawn, but Lyra stepped forward, her hands igniting with raw energy. She moved with a precision and confidence that took Nathan's breath away, deflecting shots and disarming guards with calculated strikes. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting back. The battle was chaotic and brutal, But Nathan didn't waver. He focused on completing the upload, the virus spreading through the facility systems, disabling defenses, and overloading critical functions. He could feel the building shaking beneath them as the self-destruct sequence activated. Lyra stood over the fallen guards, her chest heaving as the last sparks of energy faded from her hands. She turned to Nathan, her expression hard. "Is it done?" Nathan nodded, grabbing her arm. "We need to go." Now they ran through the collapsing facility, the walls crumbling around them as explosions ripped through the structure. Nathan's heart pounded as they reached the exit, the heat and noise of the destruction roaring in his ears. He pushed Lyra ahead of him, shielding her from the debris as they burst into the open air. The facility collapsed behind them, a cloud of smoke and fire rising into the night sky. Nathan and Lyra stood in silence, their breaths ragged, their bodies aching. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Lyra turned to him, her silver eyes shining with a mix of relief and something else, something softer. "It's over," she said, her voice quiet. Nathan nodded, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. There were still others out there, other facilities, other victims, but for now, they had won. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Lyra stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Thank you for everything." Nathan met her eyes, his exhaustion giving way to a faint smile. "We did this together," she smiled back. And in that moment, Nathan realized that their fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about freedom, hers, his, and the freedom of those who couldn't fight for themselves. Together, they would face whatever came next.